Hello, welcome to a webinar sponsored by the ABA section on civil rights and social justice. Today's program is also co-sponsored by the ABA Commission on Youth at Risk and the ABA Standing Committee on Gun Violence. Now, our focus today is really thinking about school violence, but really thinking about it from an upstream perspective, right? How do we change the environments in our schools? How do we create safe, positive environments in our schools? And we have a wonderful group of presenters who we will hear from over the next hour and a half. So I will introduce them briefly, and then I will let them get to it, and we will have time for Q&A at the end that I will facilitate. Before I forget, I want to draw your attention to the drop-down menu. For me, it's on the right-hand side of my screen, and there's a part that says questions. We invite all of you to ask your questions here, and I will synthesize those and get our various wonderful presenters involved in answering those when we get towards the end of our program today. So that's the plan. And of course, before I forget, I should introduce myself. My name is Christy Bowman. I'm the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs at Michigan State University College of Law. And as an education law scholar, these issues are certainly important to me, and I also should say, as a parent, these issues are important to me as well. So I'm very glad for the ABA section on civil rights and social justice to be facilitating and organizing this event today. Now, I would like to briefly introduce our absolutely incredible panelists, and I'm sure your assessment of them will be as glowing as mine is after you get to hear a little bit about what they have to say. So first, we will hear from Dr. Dewey Cornell. He is a forensic clinical psychologist and the Bunker Professor of Education in the Curry School of Education at the University of Virginia. He has been a faculty associate of the Institute of Law, Psychiatry, and Public Policy since 1986, and he directs the UVA Youth Violence Project. I'll introduce all of our speakers in the order in which you'll hear from them, and then after that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Cornell. Our second speaker is Dr. Dorothy Espelage. She is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Florida and an expert on bullying, youth aggression, teen dating violence, and youth suicide. Our third speaker, Dr. Yoli Anion, is an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Denver. Her work focuses on racial disparities in education, school-based interventions, and positive youth development approaches. Our fourth speaker is Michael Dunley. Michael is a classroom teacher who has been teaching second grade for the last 15 years in Tabernacle, New Jersey. He is a New Jersey State Teacher of the Year finalist. He's board certified as an early childhood education generalist. He received the Presidential Award of Excellence in Math and Science Teaching in 2016. And we also have the great privilege today to hear from three high school seniors. And you see them all together, gathered in one space on your screen. So they're all physically together as they're talking with us today. So this group of incredible kids. First, we have Lucas Johnson. Lucas is a senior at Monticello High School in Charlottesville. Second, Alex Moreno. Alex is a senior at Western Albemarle High School in Crozet, Virginia. And then finally, we have Chitsu Thompson, and she is a senior at Albemarle High School just outside Charlottesville. And just before we started, we were talking about their plans and where they're going in the fall. Do I remember correctly, Lucas, you're headed to?
Bowdoin.
Remind me, Bowdoin? Okay. And then Chitsu and Alex are headed to UVA. So Dewey, you might see them in a class one day down the road here. All right. Well, that's all for the beginning and all that I need to say to kick things off today. Without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Dewey Cornell.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. I have a boatload of information I'm going to sail through as quickly as I can. There are copies of the slides available, so if there's anything you miss or want more information, that's available. There's contact information for me. Happy to get an email from you and follow up that way as well. So main points that I want to cover today are, first of all, that school violence is part of a larger problem of gun violence. Schools are safer than the public really perceives. Second, I want to talk about the way that school violence has stimulated harmful consequences in school discipline and security.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think we can see your PowerPoint.
Oh my, that's no good.
I'm just looking at something and it looks like a connect to go to webinar screen. I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but I was hoping we could get that straightened before.
Thank you very much, because I thought we had this all hooked up, but let me, I had to reboot and I think I need to go back and change the monitor. Okay, can you see it?
No problem. I see a slide that says main points. Is that where you want to start?
Okay.
Perfect.
Yes,
okay, thank you.
I was halfway through my main points, hopefully not shouting too loud. So, number one, school violence is a small part of a larger problem. Number two, the fear of school violence has stimulated some harmful consequences, school discipline and security. And then third, I want to talk about a multi-tiered approach to school violence prevention. And under that, I want to talk about first the notion of a safe and supportive school climate, which all the speakers are going to elaborate on. And then I'll talk specifically at the end about school threat assessment. So I know I've got about 20 minutes and about 66 slides. So pardon me for trying to move a little quickly here. Let's see. So certainly school shootings have raised a lot of concern in the public. In many communities that have experienced them, that they have obviously a traumatic effect. They're so traumatic that they have, I think, misled the public and school boards into thinking that our schools are not safe and that we need elaborate, extensive, expensive security measures to protect our young people. Certainly we want to keep our schools safe, but we've got to take a more objective look at this problem. Really, I think there are two separate processes ongoing. One is that many people, of course, have been devastated by the shootings. It's a very traumatic event, and we need a process of recovery. And that's mostly a process of emotional support. But we need a second process that is more analytical, more factual, looking objectively at what can we do to prevent these kinds of shootings from occurring again. Certainly, we've been reminded that we've had lots of school shootings across the country. This organization has a record of school shootings since the Sandy Hook shooting. You know, to see 300 shootings on a map is certainly very, very troubling, very disturbing, maybe conveys the message that schools are not safe. I want to suggest to you a somewhat different way to look at this map. How many shootings occur outside of schools? And what would that map look like if we put those shootings on the map? Well, how many shootings have we had? If we look to CDC for national vital statistics data, we find that we have about 33,000 firearm deaths every year, about 2/3 of which are suicide, about 1/3 homicide. We have about 67,000 injuries where somebody is injured and receives hospital treatment. We have no idea how many shootings occur where nobody's hit or injured. That's an astronomical number. But if we just look at the shootings where someone was injured or killed, there's about 275 shootings every day in the United States. So let's apply that to our map. 300 shootings in schools over 5 years. But how many shootings have we had in 5 years outside of schools? Well, conservatively, we've had 500,000 shootings outside of schools in the last 5 years. So from that perspective, schools maybe don't look quite as dangerous as they seem. For every shooting in a school, there are about 1,600 shootings outside of schools. If we could make our schools impregnable, if we could turn them into Fort Knox, it would only stop less than 1% of the shootings, less than 1/10 of 1% of our shootings. So the real problem I want to suggest to you is gun violence and not school violence. The term school violence is really a misnomer. It's misleading. There's no special kind of violence caused by schools or only found in schools or created by schools. There's gun violence flooding our communities across the United States. And when you have a flood, the flood goes everywhere. And a flood will go into a school as surely as it will go into other locations. And so what we're seeing is not school violence, but gun violence. The young people who have led the March for Our Lives are doing a wonderful job, I think, of getting the message right. If you heard the speeches that they gave at the March, they didn't just focus on violence in schools. Many of the young people talked about the violence in their communities, in their homes, in stores, in public places, the larger problem of gun violence. In fact, there are about 1,400 homicides of young people, school-aged kids, every year in the United States. It's gone down actually since the 90s. But of those homicides, only about 22 per year are in schools. Did I warn you I'm going to be bombarding you with a lot of statistics and numbers? Here we go. A study that we did using FBI data looked at all the homicides that occurred in 37 states over a 6-year period, so we could get a handle on where homicides occur. It's pretty easy to see that homicides mostly occur in people's homes, secondarily in the street, parking lots, garage, restaurants and bars, and way down at the bottom of the list are schools and colleges. And in fact, restaurants are actually about 10 times more dangerous than schools. So I like to tell folks that if you're worried about being shot in a school or killed in a school, you should be far more worried about being in a restaurant, because restaurants have 10 times as many homicides as schools. And when we talk about arming our teachers, which I think is a ridiculous idea, even more ridiculous, maybe we should arm the cooks and servers in our restaurants, because they're 10 times more likely to encounter a homicide than a teacher. But because of this fear of school violence, this notion that schools are really dangerous places, we've had some negative outcomes, some negative consequences. And one is that we've become so frightened of school violence that school boards everywhere are devastating their budgets to spend millions, in fact, nationwide billions of dollars on school security measures. These measures come out of the school budget. They mean there's less money available for instruction, for student support services. This is a very expensive overreaction. I just got this advertisement in the mail a couple of weeks ago. This is a military security company that installs these bulletproof, bomb-proof, gas-proof locks for people to get into high security military entrances. They have an entrance for the FBI headquarters, for example, to stop terrorists. Now they see a market opportunity and they want to put these kinds of entrances in our schools. All of this is dreadfully expensive, and I don't know any school division. I know the young people in Albemarle County schools know that the school budget is tight, and the school system is spending money on security measures and cutting back on things like school nurses. School security measures deprive schools of resources that could be used for counseling, for bullying programs, for student support services. Another important, equally negative reaction is the rise of zero tolerance. Now, zero tolerance for firearms that started in the 1990s was a reasonable idea. No one wants young people bringing illegal firearms into schools. But zero tolerance has gone on steroids. Zero tolerance since Columbine has expanded to include draconian, drastic punishment for even the most minor misbehavior of students. We know that this has led to an increase in suspensions around the country, and that suspensions don't work. Suspensions are counterproductive. Suspensions fuel the school to prison pipeline by making it more likely that kids will fail in school, will drop out, and get involved in the legal system. Well, and of course, these consequences are racially disproportionate. Black students are suspended at about 2 to 3 times the rate of white students. and for primarily minor offenses, not for serious offenses. These are not bringing a gun to school. These are incidences involving disrespect and disruptive behavior. You're going to hear more about this from other speakers today. So, but my conclusion is that we should prevent shootings rather than simply prepare for them. Security members are preparation for shooting, and really we want to think about preventing. And I think very often our school boards and our leaders lose sight of what prevention really means. It means to keep something from happening, not to wait for it to happen and respond to it. Crisis response is not prevention. Certainly schools need crisis response plans. Every school does, but many schools have ignored what happens before the crisis. That is the idea of being proactive and preventing. I'm going to show you what people think of when they think about a school shooting, especially here in Virginia. They think about a shooter with a gun. They think about, in this case, the Virginia Tech shooting. And that image is so gripping and so frightening that people naturally think about security measures, armed guards, door locks, things like that. And really, we need to think about prevention long before the gunman shows up. We need to think about who was this young man before he got so angry, before he got so upset. Who was he in high school, in middle school, in elementary school? And what might we have done in our school that would have changed the path that he was on? And of course, this is the three-tiered model of prevention. This is a public health model used in medical fields, used in many fields, and in education widely used. The idea that we have programs for all students to benefit everyone. We have a second layer for those who are at risk, and a third level for those who are most in need of intensive interventions. Prevention really begins with a safe and supportive school climate for all students. When we have a safe and supportive school climate, everyone can learn, everyone has the opportunity to be successful. And so what do we mean by a school climate? Well, here in Virginia, we've spent many years working to develop a school climate survey. We did a lot of this work originally in Albemarle County schools. Some of these folks on our panelists here may have taken earlier versions of these surveys as we tried to come up with the right items and the right questions. And with federal funding, we developed a model of school climate, which we call the authoritative school climate. What this means is this is kind of borrowed from the developmental research on parenting. We know that parents are most effective when they're demanding and warm, that they're both have high expectations for their kids and they are supportive and responsive to them. And we've applied this model to schools, and we find that schools that are high on these characteristics have beneficial outcomes for their students. And I'm going to run through a little bit of the evidence for that. In the parenting field and in school climate, we can talk about the idea of authoritative schools, meaning that they are both demanding and structured and supportive of their students. And when we look at schools, we look at these dimensions. Here are the items that we use to ask students and teachers whether the school climate is structured, whether discipline is strict, but also fair. And schools that where many students answer these positively have much better environment. And then the other dimension is support, how supportive the school is. And here again are the questions that we've discovered can be used to measure how supportive the school environment is. So these two dimensions I'm going to show you are very useful in classifying schools and classifying school climate. I'm not going to go through these statistical analyses, just to say that we spend a lot of time and effort to make sure that these are statistically reliable and valid measures. And what we find is if we take our high schools and our middle schools and we classify them into those that are high in structure and high in support, that's over here on the right-hand side, the authoritative schools, and we compare them with those that are low on structure or low on support, those that are low on both, we see that students in the authoritative schools are much more engaged in school. That is, they like school, they're more engaged in school, they're proud of their school, they feel like they belong at their school. Now I'm going to show you a whole series of charts that really convey the same message. If we look at how much teasing and bullying goes on in a school, How much teasing and bullying do students report? We again find it over here on the right that schools that are authoritative, that are structured and demanding and supportive, those schools have the lowest teasing and bullying. And when we survey the teachers also report that those schools have the less teasing and bullying. We've applied this over the years to many different outcomes. We've looked most recently at sexual harassment. How much do students report sexual harassment in the school? And again, we find that the schools that are most structured and supportive have the lowest rates of sexual harassment. They were at the 42nd percentile versus the 60th percentile. We've applied this to teachers. We asked teachers, how often has a student threatened you or struck you or spoke disrespectfully to you? And if we sum this all together into a measure of student aggression, what we see is that the schools that are most authoritative have the lowest rates of aggression toward teachers. Fightings and weapons at school. We survey students about whether they've had a fight at school, whether they've brought weapons to school. And again, authoritative school shows lower rates. So you get kind of the message here. I think this is the last one of this series. If we look at suspension rates for white and black students, we also see substantially lower suspension rates, a third to a third lower in schools that are more authoritative. So again, all of this is available to you. Each of these has a paper that we can send to you. And but overall, schools that have a positive school climate, high structure, high support, have a lot of beneficial outcomes for students. Let me just say, we did this study in a large sample of over 300 high schools. We've done it also in a sample of over 400 middle schools. We have schools across size, poverty level, minority students, urbanicity, and these results hold up across diverse samples of schools. So let me now go to the last part of my, my whirlwind talk here and talk about threat assessment as one particular method of preventing violence. So we want a positive school climate. That's a universal primary approach, but we also need a way to respond to young people who are at risk or young people who maybe have threatened violence. And that's where school threat assessment comes in as one such approach. Now, nearly 20 years ago, the FBI and the Secret Service recommended that schools use a threat assessment approach. And most of us in education said, what's that? We don't know what threat assessment is. That's kind of a law enforcement concept. But we've adapted it for schools. Threat assessment in schools is a problem-solving approach to violence prevention. It involves assessment and intervention when a student has threatened violence in some way. And this really begins when somebody is concerned, when somebody, a family member, a friend, a teacher, is concerned that somebody seems distressed, they seem angry, they've engaged in some kind of threatening behavior. And then we have a team at the school, multidisciplinary at the team of the school, that will look into the threat, will evaluate what's going on, try to figure out what the problem is, what the conflict is, and intervene appropriately. The team takes action based on the seriousness of the threat, what protective action is needed, what problem stimulated the threat, and what can be done to resolve that problem. We developed the threat assessment manual that we use to help school-based teams work through a decision tree to decide how serious a threat is. We want to avoid overreaction to student threats. This is a boy, it's probably the quintessential example of an overreaction. You can see he chewed his Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. And for that was a zero tolerance violation. That was a weapons violation. And he was suspended from school for his Pop-Tart gun. Dorothy knows what I'm going to say next. The only thing dangerous about this boy's behavior is what he ate. So underreaction, that's the other error that we want to avoid, of course, and schools want to avoid this most of all because it means that a shooting might occur in the school. So that's what threat assessment is all about. Recognizing that threats fall on a continuum. We have threats that are figures of speech, that are jokes, that are expressions of anger, and really only here at the top are a small number of threats that really are warnings of impending violence. And so with threat assessment, we try to make those distinctions. We try to understand why the student made a threat so that we can prevent it from being carried out. So we've done a lot of research on threat assessment. I'm going to go through each of these studies one at a time and report all the results. Well, not really, but I'll be happy to send you copies of them. I want to just say in summary, though, that when we do studies of threat assessment, we find that 99% of the threats are not carried out. Only 1% of the students are expelled, about 1% are arrested. Suspension rates go down. Racial disparities in suspensions are either reduced or in a study I'm going to show you here at the end, they were absent. And we see that the schools make more use of counseling, and the students and teachers report a more positive school climate. So in 2013, after the Sandy Hook shooting, Virginia actually mandated that K-12 schools have threat assessment teams. And we obtained a grant, thanks to the U.S. Department of Justice, that allowed us to examine the implementation of threat assessment in our schools. Here's one study that we've reported recently that looked at 1,800 threats of violence in Virginia schools in about 800 schools. You can see there are threats at all grade levels. You can see that there are lots of things that students threaten to do, to kill, to shoot, to stab someone. And they threatened mostly other students. About 2/3 of the threats were other students, but everyone got some threats somewhere. And fortunately, however, none of these threats, almost none of these threats were carried out. Less than 1% were carried out, that's 0.7%. None of them resulted in a serious injury. We had some fights, but no shootings. Let me just say in terms of school response that the school made differentiated response rather than a zero tolerance response. So only 1% were arrested, only 1% were expelled. Almost all the students were able to return to their school with no change in school placement. And when we looked at the disciplinary consequences and we divided them up by race, white, Black, and Hispanic students were treated the same. That is, they were equally likely to be suspended from school, equally likely to have a change in placement, and only a small percentage of all groups were expelled, arrested, or incarcerated. So we were very pleased to see that when schools take a threat assessment approach, they sit down with the child, they interview, they look at the circumstances, they take a problem-solving approach, their need to suspend or expel a student goes down, and those racial disparities that we have in Virginia and we see nationwide were not present for this sample of 1,800 students. So key points about threat assessment, and then I'll be done. You need to adapt threat assessment for schools. We need to avoid criminalizing students, and we need to take a help-oriented approach, a problem-solving approach to provide support for students. Let me just say we're having some good success in Virginia, but we know that many schools need more training, they need systematic training, and we need more research to make sure that we have high-quality threat assessment in our schools. So in conclusion, school violence is a small part of a much larger problem of gun violence. I know we're not going to talk generally about gun violence today, but we need a broader approach. Schools are a lot safer than the public thinks, and prevention really needs to begin with a positive school climate and a problem-solving approach such as threat assessment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Cornell. That establishes a wonderful foundation for our conversation today. And so now we turn to Dr. Esplage to talk more about creating a positive school climate.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, thank you so much, Dewey. That was a good setup for hopefully what complements what I'm going to talk about. So I want to take my 15 minutes and really talk about the importance of building on what Dewey's talked about, building in youth voice. And certainly several of us have done large-scale randomized clinical trials and evaluated social emotional learning programs and violence prevention programs. but the reality is that they've had limited success. And what I want to talk about today is a different way in which we're thinking about youth violence. This is a grant that's funded by the National Institute of Justice, and I hear an echo, so I'm going to try to not talk so loud. That might help. Okay, so this was funded by NIJ with my colleagues at the University of Oregon, Claudia Vincent, Hill Walker, and Chris Murray, as well as the tech company. This particular grant was focused on working with youth through focus groups and strategic planning to create a reporting app such that they could report both emotional and physical safety concerns that they have, but at the same time having access to resources for issues that they might, or challenges that they're having, or things that their friends are involved in. So really what we did for 2 years, which is remarkable given I'm a heavy quantitative researcher, is that we sat down with kids, high school kids who had lots to say about the climate in their schools and what needed to be improved. We sat down with their parents, we sat down with teachers and administrators to really get a handle on why is this that we know that students have knowledge, but this is not necessarily incorporated into the safety planning that we do at the school level. And oftentimes tragic events like school shootings, we usually find out that kids had some knowledge of this prior to the event, some information that might have been helpful. We really wanted to understand at that point 2 years ago, before Parkland, why students would not come forward. And certainly the literature is replete with reasons for this, of distrust and snitching, which we continue to hear in our focus groups. But the reality is that we have to really do give a voice to youth. In a lot of our meta-analysis, we found that bullying prevention programs actually made things worse in high school. There are many reasons for that. At the same time, we also, when we do move the needle around violence within the schools, this is not usually sustainable over time. So one way in which we've been thinking about this as a team is how do we incorporate youth voice? How do we make them really meaningful partners, not just invite them to a meeting, but actually participate in genuine partnership? How can we do this in such a way, the youth encouraged us, in an efficient, easy way of reporting, such that their concerns are taken seriously over time? When we talked to the kids, they also felt that in these schools, and these are schools in Illinois and Oregon, which was remarkable, 2 different communities, but had very, very similar concerns. They felt that schools needed to work harder to promote that school climate, and certainly we've heard from Dewey some ideas about how to do that. They also felt that adults did a pretty good job focusing on their physical safety, but were quite dismissive of emotional safety concerns. Now, that was surprising that the students said that, because the administrators themselves and teachers felt that they had seen the highest rates of anxiety, depression, and isolation, both from K through 12 across the school years, but there was a sense in the students that the teachers and administrators weren't paying attention to that. It was very, very clear in every one of the high schools that we've been in that fairness and equity issues are not addressed, and when they're addressed in such a way that it's almost Band-Aid approaches. But the root of some issues that are contributing to isolated kids, contributing to inequities and discipline, was largely rooted in the adults being inequitable. And so we do know from research, Dewey's work as well as folks across the country, that when there is a positive school climate, they're more likely to report, they're more likely to engage in that problem solving that Dewey talked about. And so we need to think about how do we get kids to be connected, to feel bonded, to be genuinely engaged. And we do know that that is a protective factor. The focus groups, really, the kids pointed to some real problems of things and barriers to open communication. In many of our schools, the bullying, harassment, aggression was quite prevalent, and students felt that the staff didn't handle this very appropriately. There's also things in the schools that weapons, drugs, and alcohol on campus that also posed some threats to safety, and also threats to reporting any knowledge that they had. There's lack of supports for students with mental health challenges. I think we're hearing that over and over again, and I fear with the hardening of the schools that and taking away that very precious educational budget that we're going to continue to hear this over time. There continues to be overt discrimination in our schools, and some of our kids have examples since the election of just how the election has changed the ways in which boys and girls interact in a binary sense, and the ways in which they justify their behavior based on what we see on the television or on Twitter accounts. They also thought that relational aggression and just kind of reputation damaging was still quite prevalent in high schools. And when we did extensive focus group coding, we also found that the kids were very, very clear that they felt as if they were expected to have social emotional competencies or like empathy and perspective taking, conflict management. And in some cases, there are places for them to be taught this, whether it's through the curriculum or opportunities and student campaigns, et cetera. But they felt that the staff and teachers were lacking in social emotional competencies as well. I'm going to segue here, which we did not hypothesize this, right? This was just a theme that was coming up, that kids really had distrust in the adults, but they also felt the adults weren't equipped to manage some things beyond academics in the classroom. And so being a professor that has researched social emotional learning programs and evaluated these programs, we kept hearing that the adults needed these social emotional competencies if in fact they were going to promote that in the kids. But we also started hearing that the social emotional learning programs they were exposed to, or the content, was actually kind of lacking in an infusion of equity issues. And so there's very few social emotional learning program researchers or developers that are considering how do you infuse equity issues within these programs. And certainly I'm going to point to some of the cutting edge work that's being done now. But for a long time, social emotional learning and in the work of the Consortium of Academic Social Emotional Learning have failed to consider how we can leverage these types of programs that are quite prevalent in our schools. And programs, I mean, it could be a CAN program, but it could also be after school programs, art programs. And so we're really pushing to think about how do we infuse equity into social emotional learning programs. And that came from the kids really, really talking about how we needed to think, the teachers needed to think about their own vision around social emotional learning. Now, this isn't anything new. Hoffman had written about this in 2009, that we needed to start thinking about integrating equity into social emotional learning programs. We do know, as Dewey noticed, and I'm in the state of Florida, so this is even more transparent for me here, that the gap in student achievement and dropout rates and discipline kind of inequities is quite prevalent for racial and ethnic minorities. Also, I would add, because of my work with gender and sexual minorities, that we see issues there as well as the intersection of those two. And so we're at a point where we need to integrate equity into SEL programs and focusing on those adults as well as role models of these behaviors. Hoffman had really had a nice summary of really we have to think about empowering kids to understand their cultural backgrounds and think about their own social emotional learning definitions. And there has been a challenge for teachers to be aware of their own cultural dynamics and beliefs and behaviors and how that plays out when they're interacting with kids that might have very, very different backgrounds. And so certainly the cultural norms affect the interpretation of emotional experiences. And we have to recognize that the social emotional learning programs and the ways in which we're delivering actually might be Eurocentric and not applicable to many of the populations, as the demographics and the makeup of the families and kids in our schools are changing drastically day by day. Certainly, we want to think about the broader societal issues. Most of the social emotional learning programs do not consider the institutional racism or discrimination that's contributing to unsafe spaces in our schools. And so this is a real challenge when you want to do this work in the schools. But most of those programs that are developed, they develop them such that they could be incorporated and scaled up in very conservative places in the United States. And here we find that we need to think about maybe more palatable if we start thinking about competence and resilience promotion and problem solving approaches, but also recognizing that there are racial and ethnic and class inequities in our schools, in our funding of education and broader society that are playing out every day, as if it's on a screen in many of the schools. If you spend time in the schools, it's very, very obvious to see this. So when we think about equity-oriented social-emotional learning, we want to think about consciousness and the disparities in schools, opportunities and gaps, and really leverage the rings of culture to include youth culture, nationality, gender, and ethnicity. And for the young scholars that are going off to Bowdoin and UVA, if you're intrigued by any of these things that I've said, this chapter by Anne Gregory out of Rutgers and Fergus is a beautiful demonstration of where we need to go with equity-oriented social-emotional learning and school discipline reform. So I encourage you to check that entire book out. It's very thought-provoking. But this really does get to this understanding, how do we leverage resiliency within those students in our building. I'm going to end with two slides. I'm going to flip through these just because I'm running out of time, to say that it's not just thinking about addressing equity through social-emotional programming. To also recognize that some of us live in states where we can't say social-emotional learning, so you want to say workforce development. But the other thing that we're really, really pushing hard for in our work, and we're lucky to be funded by Justice also, to work with school resource officers of Miami-Dade police, so school police department. They have 200 SROs. They had 200 SROs prior to Parkland. They're getting 300 SROs because of our new law in Florida. And we are very, very fortunate that we're able to develop online professional development for the SROs around trauma-informed approaches and trauma-informed schools. We're also developing curriculum around restorative problem solving, which we'll hear about in the next presentation, social-emotional learning, and we're actually going to get the SROs to understand the challenges that they have in some areas of the social-emotional learning. And then, of course, we have a professional development online program we're developing around implicit bias. We believe that those four domains, building skills in the kids that we work with, but also building skills in the adults that are surrounding these kids that oftentimes role model less than socially competent behavior, and that's what the kids said. Combine that with changing the question of what's wrong with you when you act out to what happened to you, and really understanding adverse childhood experiences and trauma effects on the brain, and giving the adults in the building a better tool than just suspension or arresting them, I could say that. Then if in fact we take a different approach of really restorative problem solving, where we figure out where the hurt is and work as a team to come together as an alternative to expulsion and suspensions, that I think that we'll have, we need every adult in these buildings interacting with a child and not giving up on them, but also just creating a safe space for kids to take that risk and for kids to learn different ways of reacting when in fact trauma has put them in what would be very adaptive given their background, giving them other ways of interacting besides violence. So hopefully that was helpful to talk through. I always like to give youth voice, and I can't wait to hear the high schoolers talk. I'm looking forward to it, and I hope that this presentation gives you some sample where we need to go as our country is hardening schools. We also have to try to soften them up a little bit at the same time and create spaces where kids can thrive and strive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Esplez. That was really interesting to think about in more detail what our schools could look like and what they would feel like, as what they would be like as experiences when we start to change some of our fundamental assumptions about what we need to be doing in schools. So thank you very much. Now, you've probably noticed that both of our first two presenters also touched on issues related to racial and ethnic equity and how those factor into the issues that they were talking about. Now, our next presenter, Dr. Yoli Anyan, will delve even more deeply into that and also thinking about school discipline. Dr. Anyan. Dr. Anyan, I'm not sure if we can hear you. I cannot, at least.
How's that?
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you.
Sorry about that. I just want to reiterate a couple points that were already made, and then I'll focus specifically on restorative practices. So the first is that we really are in this moment of historical deja vu, that zero tolerance policies were enacted in response to school shootings, and these tough on crime policies really introduced harsh penalties that punished really typically developmentally normative behaviors, and led to the expansion of police and security guards in schools, also metal detectors and security cameras. So as other presenters have mentioned, these are back on the table again. And it's really important to note that suspensions are not typically used for serious violent or criminal behavior. They're mostly for minor infractions like disrupting class, tardiness, and dress code violations. So not only are they not used for the kinds of offenses that led to their introduction in schools, they're also quite ineffective and in many cases harmful. So most relevant to our focus today, schools with higher rates of suspension and expulsion have less satisfactory ratings of school climate. They also, in terms of individual impacts, reduce students' likelihood of school success and increase their risk for school dropout, arrest, and incarceration. So that trajectory from school to prison is what Dr. Cornell referred to as the school to prison pipeline. And as he mentioned and others have mentioned, not only are these practices ineffective and harmful, they're also inequitable. As long as we've tracked this data, we have evidence of disparities, particularly for Black students, but also for more recent research is showing evidence that sexual minority students, students of difference, students with disabilities, all tend to be more harshly punished for the same behaviors than students who are more advantaged or typical. So an alternative to suspensions and to a zero tolerance approach is the use of restorative practices. So restorative practices are a school climate and culture framework that uses inquiry-based and relationship-focused strategies to assess and acknowledge conflict and challenges, implement problem-solving action, and techniques geared towards repairing harm, community, and connection across the environment. So in general, restorative practices are based on the idea that harm should be acknowledged openly, and as the previous speaker mentioned, that harm is really bigger than an individual. It's about harm to a community, what happened to the community when there's conflict, and that collectively, so using young people's voices to find a solution or a resolution to the problem can be empowering to everyone while also holding individuals accountable. So all types of restorative practices, from peace circles to individual mediations, are guided by several key questions. So one, the last speaker just mentioned, what happened, what harm was done, who was affected and how, who caused the harm, and what piece of responsibility can each person, each party take, and then how can the harm be repaired? So this is where youth voice comes into play. What ideas do young people have about how to make it right? Dr. Cornell introduced the MTSS or RTI triangle, where we saw tiered interventions from universal, school-wide, to more targeted interventions to young people who exhibit problem behaviors. Restorative practices can be used along that same continuum. At the universal level, there are things like peace circles, where you really focus on building relationships and community. There's no harm that's been done necessarily, and instead it's really about team building. And then teachers can use affective statements with all students that acknowledge and describe feelings that come up when conflict occurs or misbehavior happens, and really is about building both teachers and students' social emotional skills. And then peace circles can also be used reactively, so in response to a conflict or a problem, using those key questions that I mentioned. And then Restorative dialogues and mediations use those key questions, but dialogues are less formal. They kind of happen on the fly, and mediations are much, take more time. They usually involve pre-conferencing where people involved in the conflict have an opportunity to share their perspective on what happened individually, and then there's a shared mediation with everyone involved. And then family group conferencing is similar to what I just described in terms of mediations, but involves family members. So this is just a great diagram that illustrates how a restorative school would respond compared to a zero tolerance school. So both in terms of how young people arrive at school, what their experience is being greeted by metal detectors versus teachers and administrators welcoming them by name. In this case, the student Carlos arrives late. In a zero tolerance school, he's scolded in front of everyone and given a detention, compared to a restorative school where the teacher might wait till after class to ask what happened and then address the root of the problem, which is this heated argument that he had with his parents, by setting up a meeting with a school counselor. Then after Carlos is late to class, he gets into a minor altercation, might be pushing between students. In a zero tolerance school, the school police officer would detain and arrest those students. In a restorative school, peer mediators might get involved and use those questions to de-escalate the situation. Reflecting the school to prison pipeline, in a zero tolerance school, Carlos is held in a juvenile detention facility, misses school, and now has an arrest record, where in a restorative school, they come up with a solution of cleaning the cafeteria because that's where they got in a fight and the area got messy, and that then Carlos meets with his counselor and parents. So you really get a sense of many of the approaches, both social emotional learning and threat assessment, being reflected in a restorative school. So really thinking about restorative practices as an approach, not as program or like one way, something where you just pull out young people and do things in an office, but that this way of thinking is infused throughout the school. And as Dr. Esplanage mentioned, we have limited but growing evidence of the promise of restorative practices. So research that Anne Gregory has done has found that teachers who use restorative practices or a restorative approach in their classroom more often have stronger relationships with their students than teachers who don't use that kind of approach or use it less often. And they also have fewer referrals to the office for discipline incidents. And this was especially true for Black and Latino youth. So that's one study that showed the impact on office discipline referrals, but we really are concerned about suspension because that's the primary mechanism that fuels the school to prison pipeline in addition to law enforcement referrals and tickets. And research that I've done in Denver Public Schools, controlling for a variety of different confounds, found that students who received a restorative approach were significantly less likely to, in the first semester, were significantly less likely to be sent back to the office and were significantly less likely to have a suspension than students who got another approach like in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. And that this likelihood of suspension dropped even more significantly in schools that used the approach more often. So all students who were disciplined had a 72% chance of being sent back to the office. That means most students are having multiple discipline incidents. But if they received restorative practices, that chance went down to 28%. And if they received restorative practices in a school that used restorative practices more often than most schools, that chance went down to 18%. Then another study that we did in Denver Public Schools was focused on the strategies used by low suspending schools. So we did focus groups and interviews at 33 schools that had low suspension rates, and consistently teachers, school leaders reported that restorative practices was a strategy that they used not only for building community and addressing harm, but also to support student social emotional development and to deal with low level, well, actually all types of misbehavior. So that's the summary of my presentation, and anyone is welcome to contact me at any time with questions at my email address. So thanks, I'll let the next presenter speak.
Thank you, Dr. Onion. That is really helpful. And again, it's so important, I think, to really be disaggregating this data and thinking about how these different interventions can have various impacts on different students who we're serving in our schools. Now, next, we would like to turn to Michael Dunley. Mr. Dunley is going to talk about the impact of the threat of gun violence in his classroom with his students and how he seeks to create a positive environment in that space. Mr. Dunley.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be part of such an important conversation. And in reaction to the three speakers who have gone before me, I just wanted to point out that so much of what you've been saying resonates with me as a 15-year classroom teacher. I can attest that even if it may be anecdotal, I've seen a consistent increase in student anxiety over the whole of my career. That can be also data collected in the fact that there have been many more guidance counselor visits from my students and many more referrals for intervention. Another way in which a lot of this hardening of the schools is impacting student learning right now is that the drills have gotten extremely long and complicated, where they used to be only 5 minutes or shorter. Now they are lasting for 20 to 25 minutes. That disrupts so much learning and teaching, but also with each minute, anyone who is in any way fragile emotionally or psychologically, it just compounds the impact that those drills are having on them. And as we know, all the research that has been stated about the brain-based learning, that when children are fearful, or even adults when they're fearful, their brains are not in a learning mode. So it really does have a negative impact, and I've watched it happen in my current district and in my previous district, where money is allocated that should have gone to classrooms. It could be class size reduction by hiring additional teachers. It's gone to security guards, vestibules being reconstructed to make them safer, and money that was set aside originally for technology increase has been reallocated for this hardening of the building. So I've watched the impact of these decisions play out. But to just bring it down to the ground level of what I do and every day, and what many other educators do, is we basically try to make students feel socially, emotionally, and physically safe. And that is the core of what, here's some information for anyone that wanted to get in touch with me. But basically, it goes back to something that Dr. Anyan was just saying about how restorative justice and restorative practices, where teachers who have that practice have better relationships with their students. Just to give you some of the things that we do in classrooms to help increase that relationship building, is one of the things that happens in almost every class is that students will arrive mid-year or late year. And it's very disruptive to the organization of a classroom where everything is alphabetized. It might be every student knows that there's certain groups you've worked in that have been positive and others we've had to be moved around. So all of that comes up, and the typical response is that it's an imposition. And that imposition resounds with that student. So one of the things that I've always done is I've kept an extra desk ready for that student that comes, and the message that that student gets is that we've been waiting for them, as opposed to them disrupting what we're doing in our classroom. They've actually been the person we've been waiting for. That simple twist of that really makes a student feel welcomed and belonging, which I think is really at the core of changing how students feel in their school, safe and that they belong. The student voice was that in students have a choice as to learn about what they're interested in, what they're passionate about, and to follow their own self-directed learning. Increase in student voice is something that's very important to make students feel more a member of a community. In my classroom, we use student surveys where I am able to assess what level of comfort they have with their fellow students and with the learning and the class itself. And also to make them feel that they have a relationship that does not end in June. Something that I've done every year is I email my students twice a year, every student I've ever had. So after they've left the year in my classroom in second grade, they go to third grade, I give them an email at the end of summer saying, good luck in your upcoming year. And then again, right before the time when all the standardized tests are applied, to let them know that I have faith in them and that I believe in them and that they're more than just a test score and that they can overcome this. And they really have a sense of, once a student of mine, you're always a student of mine, and that relationship can continue well beyond the 180-day school year. And the feedback that comes back from that, from parents and from students, is quite profound, and it encourages me to continue to do that type of reaching out and building relationships. Another way in which we can really make schools feel safe and inviting and welcoming is to really change the design. And flexible seating allows students to be able to choose where they're most comfortable. As kids have become more and more anxious and nervous about life in general or in learning, that the room can become part of a way in which you can address that anxiety level and bring it down. So you're looking at pictures of my classroom, and the one on the left is, it quite literally says on the wall, "You matter." My co-teacher put that there, but we put these fireplace scenes up on the monitor during reading time or during different parts of the day. There's soft music playing in the background. Children are allowed to find the spot where they're most comfortable. In subjects such as math, which is often linked with anxiety and fear, they're able to become quite comfortable and the learning actually increases. So all of this really goes hand in hand with the arrangement of the furniture as much as what you do with your relationship building in the classroom. And there are thankfully more trends moving towards this. We do not call it a classroom, we call this area the living room. And it just makes children feel like it's a more natural part of their home life. When they come in, they really feel as if it's a part of their extension of their home. In this classroom, we also are not confined to the four walls. We Skype, we Zoom, we Google Hangout with children who are of different backgrounds to help deal with the lack of diversity in our classroom, which will build empathy, which only continues to really help the sense of connectedness and belonging. And then, of course, the emotional space, which is the most important. And I find it so jarring that certain states you can't even say social emotional learning. It's always been a part of the classroom, but it's becoming a greater focus percentage. We have to now work with the social emotional whole child prior to getting to the academic. And every minute spent on creating that space for them to feel welcomed and supported and safe will pay off, because in the later part of the year, you are far more able to focus on academic subjects. So in this way, we connect with the students around the world. We do have a responsive classroom. We have morning meetings. We build community throughout sharing, turning, and having empathy conversations. I've already mentioned the student surveys, which are actual tools that were created by the Gates Foundation in 2005. So there is a lot of science behind them, and Dr. Ferguson from Rutgers was the tripod survey that was part of that. So it's a science-based survey that really yields a lot of information about how children feel in the classroom and how does that impact their learning. But then the social inventory surveys are very new, and you might have heard of them, but what we do is I will have students take an index card, and about 3 times a year, just have them write down 3 names of the students they most want to sit with or work with. And what I and my co-teacher will do is we'll go over these cards. It's anonymous. They're not allowed to talk with one another while they fill these out. And we're able to really keep an eye on what children are being selected most and which children are being not chosen by anyone. And we're able to really focus our efforts on helping build up their social inventory, in the sense that if we need to send them to the nurse to get some more tissues, they get to choose someone to go with them. We can focus a lot of our efforts to make sure that no child becomes marginalized or pushed to the edge or socially disconnected, and we can really help them. Children tend to navigate towards, an adult affirmation. So if we start to reward those children with compliments or with our attention, other children will navigate and start to support them, because they know that if they're with them, then they're with us. So there's things that you can do to really help change the climate of your classroom. And lastly, but what not it's not the last in importance, we've really shifted to addressing the anxiety levels of the students by having yoga, which we have, we are careful and call it mindfulness. But we have mindfulness activities. We ring a bell for deep breathing with all the science behind the chemistry involved with deep breathing, self-reflection, and the children have really changed over the years, and both their emotional level coming in and their emotional needs coming in September, but also in the way in which we address these issues, they're leaving more emotionally mature than they ever have. So they're prepared to go on to the next grade level or the next event. And we really take the children who have gone through anything at home, and we really make the classroom a space where they can come to, and it will be ready for them no matter what has happened prior to them crossing the threshold into the classroom. Just to give you an example of what kind of classroom I teach in, we had a student that went out on medical leave, and we were in the middle of a fourth book of a reading of the Borrower's Book series. And so as not to let her miss out, we Zoomed her in during the read aloud portion of the day, each day that she was at home recovering. And it allowed the students to really connect with her and her to connect with the kids. It's that way of saying we are not complete without you, that message that students need to know. Those are the ones who will not go on to feel that they don't belong or that they're disconnected. So this is just one way in which it's an example of how the classroom is a real cohesive group, and we bring you in even when you're not there. So that pretty much concludes what you can find in my classroom and in other classrooms like mine. And the definition, of course, of a positive classroom is simple. It's just that you feel safe and respectful and welcoming and supportive student learning. And I believe that that is something that I've dedicated myself to. My co-teacher does. Thankfully, my school district does. And hopefully this will be a more positive environment, which will help prevent the acts of violence that do occur, as I've learned so much from the other speakers. But one last thing, something that Dr. Espelage had mentioned about the question about what's wrong with you. That's a question that has bothered me my entire career, and it's something that I've always really highlighted whenever I've done professional development for other teachers, is that we need to address behavior and correct behavior and not correct children. There's nothing wrong with children. If there's something wrong with their behavior, we have to be really careful. And so what's wrong with you is something that would really, it would just offend me on many levels. It's, asking why are they acting this way, or how can we find the cause of what triggered that behavior and addressing that behavior, but there's nothing wrong with them. It's an important message. Semantics are so important. The words that we use become their internal voice. And we're in the business of building children up. And I cannot wait to hear from the high school students. And once again, thank you for allowing me to share with you what we do in my school and in my classroom.
Michael, thank you. It is so helpful to hear about what you're doing in your classroom. And I think everyone else probably joins me in saying your students are incredibly lucky. Your dedication to them and your creativity and devotion certainly comes through. Now, I want to mention something before we turn it over to our high school students, and that's just a few words about how I see all of these different folks and all of these different aspects of these issues connecting. Because when we hear from Michael, we're hearing from someone who is in the classroom on the front lines, right? He's interacting with children every day. And when we hear from Dorothy, Yoli, and Dewey, we're hearing sort of one step removed from that, right? So we're thinking about broader studies of classrooms and climates and the impact of policies. And the reason that this is an ABA event, an American Bar Association event, and part of the reason we're hearing from these amazing high school students is because legal change is also a part of this too, right? And so from my perspective, it's really important for all of us to be talking together, to be working together, and thinking about the tools that we each bring to situations and issues like this, and how we can work together to accomplish change. And changing law is certainly part of it, because law is not just attorneys in courtrooms thinking about downstream solutions, right? It also can be changing statutes, and that actually is where our 3 high school students come in. And so I would like to turn it over to them. I have one other thing to mention just before, but I'll turn it over to them to talk about some of the legal change that they have pursued and their thoughts and what they learned from that experience. And my other announcement right before we hear from them is to remind you all that I think we'll have a couple minutes for questions at the end of this time, right before we finish up at 2:30 Eastern. And I want to remind you that over on the right-hand bar, you can click under the questions arrow and then enter questions that you have, and then we'll have a chance for a bit of discussion. All right, so I'm not sure who's going first, but Chisu, Lucas, and Alex, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, so once again, I'm just going to start off, and I'm Alex, and I'm going to start off, and we're going to be going through the story of how we saw problems in our community and how we took steps to create a positive school environment, mainly in the avenue of mental health. So to begin with, I'm going to start with how we met. So we all attended the Sorensen Institute High School Leaders Program at the University of Virginia in the summer of 2017. Part of the program was to learn about state politics here in Virginia and then also how to write policy. So as part of the program, Chitu and I were in a specific project group that was tasked with writing a policy in the area of healthcare that we wanted to change and that we saw the problem in. And we decided to focus on mental health. So the mental health policy that we created was essentially based on increasing the amount of mental health education in the 9th and 10th grade health classes in public high schools here in the Commonwealth. And so we created this policy at Sorensen, and when the program ended, we decided that it was too important to end with the program. And Lucas, Chitu, and I came together because we had all had personal experiences with mental health and mental illness, and we all decided that was important enough that we decided to pursue it throughout 2017 and coming into 2018. So in our free time, we would work together crafting the bill, looking at the various code of law, different states, seeing what different states had done when it comes to mental health education. And we had really worked really hard to create a cohesive policy that we thought was going to benefit our Commonwealth. We also at the same time were working on some county initiatives because we wanted to change our schools and Albemarle County when it came to some things like mental health resources. So we created policies also that were designed to increase mental health resources, such as adding a mental health counselor, they're called SAP, a student assistance professional, at each of the public high schools, of the 3 public high schools here in Albemarle County. And we were able to receive the money from the Albemarle County School Board. It was $160,000 that they gave us in their budget for the creation of the 3 SAPs full-time at each of the public high schools. So we were working on kind of both levels with the state and with the local policy. And fortunately, the budget has passed, the budget is passed, and the SAPs will be in the 2018-2019 school year in all the public high schools. And through our work on the local level, through talking to different groups here in the county, we were able to catch the eye of Senator Crave Deeds, and we were able to present to Senator Crave Deeds at Monticello.
So we were able to meet with Senator Crave Deeds through the help of an individual in our county office building who dealt with students who were interested in writing policy, in which he also mentors a group of students who meet from all the high schools to come up with policy solutions. He saw our presentation on mental health, and so he contacted Chitsu and I and asked if we were interested in having a meeting with Senator Crave Deeds. And if none of you know Senator Crave Deeds, he's one of Virginia's most prominent mental health advocates. He was the state senator whose son almost killed him as a result of his son not being able to be committed to a psychiatric institution. And he looked at our bill, he came to Monticello, and we gave him a proposal to pretty much mandate under the Code of Virginia that the Commonwealth has to incorporate mental health education in 9th and 10th grade health classes. And the Department of Education has to formulate this curriculum with input not only from the state, but from numerous mental health organizations and from students like us and from teachers as well. And so he was very, very receptive to the idea, very happy with what we were doing here in Albemarle County. And so he introduced it as soon as the session started this year. And so we started immediately with work in determining how to get this passed, because only one other state in the nation has a law on the books like we do now here in Virginia, and that's New York. And so we use New York as a good model as to how we would do it here in Virginia and how the law would be written. And so we worked closely with Senator Crave office in formulating the policy. And then as soon as it was introduced and the legislative session got underway, we started to make personal trips to Richmond 3 times in order to start lobbying on behalf of the bill and in order to ensure that it would get through subcommittee and committee and then eventually to the floor. And so we were very fortunate that Senator Crave originally patroned it in the Senate, and we were called to testify before the Senate Education and Health Committee, or subcommittee. And then Delegate Rob Bell also saw the bill when we were at one of our lobbying days, and he introduced it late and stated that it was necessary to have it in the House so this could go through as fast as possible, and then it would have 2 opportunities to pass in both chambers. And we were lucky enough that our lobbying efforts worked off. A lot of people saw this bill and they said this makes complete sense. There was no fiscal impact. There was no requirement of heavy investment of time, energy, or resources from the state. It just required a change in the code and a necessity in change in mindset as to what we're teaching our students in high school and what the role of schools really are in helping stem the mental health crisis that we all face. So we were able to have it pass through both subcommittees without any issue. It was 4-0 in the Senate, 7-0 in the House. It eventually passed unanimously in both chambers, and when they crossed it again, they both passed unanimously. And then it was signed into law on March 19th of this year. So it is luckily going to be part of the curriculum for the state of Virginia, but it was because of the efforts of the individuals that were listening to us that we were able to do this. No one, as of yet, that we can tell, introduced even a similar bill in Virginia, and yet such a common sense initiative had to be brought to the attention of legislators by us. And we stated that they were often asked, what got you into this? And we said, because we saw an issue and we knew that no one else was going to act on it unless we did. And so we decided that from that point, we had to be our own best advocates in ensuring that our ideas and policy solutions got to the forefront of the issues that we all face.
And I'm Chitsu. So I was going to talk about our next initiatives. Through this process, we created our coalition called the Virginia Students Coalition for Mental Health. And so now that we've gotten this bill passed, it's a great first step. We like to think this is the first stepping stone in a long journey to improve mental health education. And so after this, some other initiatives we're looking at is spreading a similar type of bill to surrounding states. We're looking at North Carolina, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and even the DC area. As you probably are well aware of, the United States, we can't implement curriculum on the federal level. Therefore, we have to go approach each state. Another initiative we're looking at is finding federal funding for mental health programs in schools that different school counties across the nation could apply for. And other things that we noticed, mental health is a multifaceted issue. There are a lot of components and factors that are related to it. And therefore, some things we're looking at are maybe the opioid crisis, how we can help with mental health and drug addiction can be very parallel sometimes. And so our main mission statement that we are still crafting, but what we say is finding common sense solutions to issues that affect us all. And so one thing that we hope that this bill will, or we plan that this bill will help alleviate in our school is the school climate and negative stigma against mental health. And some experience that we've had is through my junior year, I noticed a lot of people would skip school or miss school, and there's this connotation, oh, they're skipping school, they're being a bad student. When in reality, later on, we find out that person was actually having a lot of mental health issues and had to go to rehab. That's why they were missing school. But rather than come up front and say, oh, I'm actually having some issues, they rather make or allow other students to believe that they're being a bad student. And then other examples are we have our student assistant professionals, SAPs. There's this hesitation for students to use these resources available for them at their schools because they are worried about what their peers would think when they went in the office or when they came out. What's wrong with that person? What's going on? And finally, one thing that I think we all can really relate to, and that's a huge issue we can see growing today, is the usage of social media and how that impacts mental health. Especially during our junior year, we had college apps going on, getting ready for all these exams. It's a very stressful time period. And for me personally, there's this thing on, if you're familiar with social media, Instagram. Well, now they have a thing called Finstagram, which is just an additional account that some students make, which is a way, you know, on Instagram you have to look your best image, right? So on Finsta, it's a way for students to relieve some of the pressures that they feel, like just talk about whatever they want or post something that doesn't look as appealing. But what I noticed in my school at least was you would see these progression of posts from people saying stuff like, oh, I want to kill myself, I'm depressed, I'm so stressed out, I want to die. And, you know, instead of students saying, hey, let me get you some help, let me support you, how can we help, you would see comments that say, oh, me too, LOL, same. And so that, first of all, it diminishes the importance of people who actually do go through mental health illnesses or face these issues, but as well, you're promoting self-demotivation, right? And so that's why we thought this is really important that we teach students what exactly is mental health, because that's the whole issue. People don't understand what it is, especially students, and we're misusing the vocabulary about how we describe and how we talk about mental health. And so I'm just going to read a quote from my friend who was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I asked her her opinion about our bill before we got it. We went to Richmond to start lobbying. I asked her if she thought this would be a good idea, and she said, if I had more information on mental health and it had been destigmatized by having it normalized in my class, I might have known and felt confident enough to get help sooner, and then would have not been so many unsafe conditions, end quote. So to conclude, what we like to say is mental health doesn't take a day off, and neither will we, and that's what we're going to do going forward.
Thank you. That's amazing. Really, really impressive. In some ways, that brings us full circle, right? Because part of how Dewey started was talking about what we have is not, and I'm paraphrasing, hopefully I'm getting close to what you would say, but in terms of school violence, basically, do we have a school crisis or do we have a wider cultural crisis, right? Do we have a gun crisis? And so many of the conversations about gun violence also tie into mental health. And so your efforts both at the school level and at the policy level to reduce the stigma are incredibly important. Chisa, you mentioned Virginia Students for Mental Health. Is that the name of the organization?
Yes, it's Virginia Students Coalition for Mental Health. We have a Facebook page. We would love more follows and likes on it to gain more support.
Okay, great. So Virginia Students Coalition for Mental Health. So you're on Facebook, any other social media that you want to let us know about in case we want to follow you?
As of right now, we have Facebook just because it can reach a wider platform. However, hopefully we can grow. We also have our email if people would like to contact us.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So we have time for a few questions here at the end. And I have one question for Dorothy, and then we'll think about questions for a number of different folks, hopefully. So Dorothy, you mentioned something, I know I noticed this, and I think Michael commented on it as well. The idea of basically needing to talk about social emotional learning as workforce development rather than actually what it is, social emotional learning. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and some of the issues that are involved with that?
Yeah, so all I can say is that I've been advised in some states, or when I'm talking to largely Republican politicians, that social emotional learning is not a word that they use. And I sat with a couple staffers to try to understand that, because that surprised me when I first heard that about 5 years ago. And the reason is that there's some conservative parents out, and there may be other reasons, but I was told by staffers in Congress that there's a sense that that social emotional learning could be brainwashing our children. So it's seen as kind of a liberal way in which we're trying to, and she said brainwashing, so I didn't put words in her mouth, and I've heard that since then. At the same time, there's also a lot of really powerful parenting groups that feel that this type of instruction of empathy and perspective taking, conflict management, really learning how to work with each other in relationships should be taught in the home, and that the school is not a place for that, that the school should be instructing around math, writing, arithmetic, and sciences and technology. I want to put a positive spin on it, though, because there's many states and many districts that embrace social emotional learning, right? At the same time, you just have to understand that I think we all could use social emotional learning every day of our lives and boosters, that you have to understand the social political context of where you're trying to do this work. And so being cognizant of that. And one way I approach this sometimes, knowing if I'm going into a conservative district or going into talk to a district where they're not allowed to use this terminology, is I'll just do an exercise and say, here's some post-its, write down those particular strengths that you need to have or traits that you need to have to be successful at your job every day. And they end up writing down the social-emotional competencies that we're all familiar with: social awareness, self-awareness, patience. Now in the South, they would say prayer or spirituality, right? They would add that. And it's kind of eye-opening to them, because once you then map that activity on to the 5 spheres of social-emotional learning, it maps on beautifully. I've never had a math teacher say that they needed to have really strong quantitative skills to be successful in the classroom. So you just have to, I caution just, I was surprised, I was set back. I always thought that we all together wanted to create safe and supportive schools and protect the most vulnerable populations in our schools. But the social political context we have to work within, such that we don't shut everyone out. Does that make sense? But yeah.
Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, I think it's a really important issue and lesson for all of us to keep in mind, right? In terms of thinking about how we're trying to get to certain goals, and that depending on the social and political context, there may be different ways, and often even just different terms, that make some ideas much more palatable in different contexts than they might otherwise be. So yeah, so that's really interesting. Absolutely. So we have a question, and this one wonders about difference in school type when we're thinking about school climate. And so I think the question is about difference potentially between traditional public schools, charter schools, private schools. So what are your thoughts on that? Dewey, if it's all right, maybe we'll start with you for any input on that
topic. I don't think the differences matter that much in terms of school climate. I was just in Broward County last week doing training for the charter schools there. And if it hadn't said charter school, I wouldn't have known any difference. The teachers and the staff there talked about their students in the same way. They were concerned about their students in the same ways. And they were receptive to threat assessment training, which we're going to start in the Broward County charter schools. Kids are kids. And, we as politicians, political people, sort people off into different school systems for political reasons, but I think school climate cuts across all of that.
Thank you. Any other comments? Yoli or Dorothy, any thoughts on that in addition? Okay. Well, we have just about 1 or 2 minutes left, so I want to throw it open to our panelists in case there are any final thoughts that you were hoping to leave our audience with. We haven't had much time to circle back, but I'll just give you a few moments in case there are any final thoughts from our incredible panelists.
Can I just say one quick thing? I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's speaking today, and also everyone who's listening. As students who grew up in a public school system, it means a lot to know how much thought and care is behind the scenes that we don't always see. Like, what we experience is for us 8 to 4, daily routine, but it just means so much to know that there's so many people advocating for us, trying to find the best ways for us to learn and grow. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your comment, and really I couldn't have said it better, and thank you to the 3 of you as well for advocating both for yourselves and your classmates, and really, for our society as you're thinking about the policies that we need to have in place going forward. Oh my goodness, so this is the end of our time together. It's been a great hour and a half. I'm sure those joining us online have enjoyed the conversation and learned as much as I have. Thank you, Michael, Yoli, Dewey, Dorothy, Lucas, Alex, Chiso, and thank you again to the American Bar Association for organizing this conversation, The Climate Change We Crave, Positive School Environments. All right, have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.